The baker's world began long before dawn, when most of the town still dreamed of heaven. He rose to the echo of silence, his back already aching from yesterday's endless toil. The fire was his first companion, glowing embers whispering promises and threats in equal measure. He fed it with dry kindling, breath by breath, until it roared like a captive beast. The oven's mouth gaped open, glowing orange, the heat clawing at his skin and resolve. By that light, the baker became both priest and servant, blessing dough, burning flesh, feeding souls. Each loaf he shaped was a quiet prayer, a fragile offering to hunger's cruel god. He knew the rhythm by heart: mix, knead, fold, rest, an eternal dance of survival. Outside, the roosters crowed, and footsteps began echoing down the narrow, cobbled arteries of the town. Women carried baskets beneath their cloaks, coins hidden in sleeves, murmuring morning psalms and gossip alike. The baker's wife greeted them without words, her face flushed, her apron damp, her eyes distant. She had long forgotten the softness of dawn. Her world was measured in flour and ash. The customers came not for pleasure, but for necessity. Bread was breath and nothing more. The poorest bought coarse loaves, heavy with rye, dark as earth and just as bitter. The rich sent servants to claim the whiter rounds, touched by finer flour and cleaner water. Yet even the finest loaf still bore the same rough hands that shaped it in smoke. In those moments, the town was united, all equal beneath hunger's quiet, unquestioning rule. A crumb was currency. A crust could save a life or start a riot's flame. The baker understood this truth better than any priest who preached from cold stone pulpits. He saw the desperation in their eyes, the trembling hands clutching copper with silent reverence. Bread was not food. It was forgiveness, a reprieve from the gnawing emptiness within. And though his labor gave life, his reward was only exhaustion, a sleep without dreams. By noon, the bakery was a furnace, the air alive with shimmering waves of heat. The boy who swept the floor coughed from the smoke, his eyes watering behind cracked lids. Soot clung to the walls like memories, black ghosts of loaves long turned to dust. Even the crucifix above the door seemed weary, its wooden Christ blistered by endless summers. And yet, through all that heat and hardship, there was something sacred in their work, a grace not spoken, but felt, in the rhythm of hands, in the patience of repetition. For in shaping dough, they shaped the day. In feeding others, they remembered what it meant to endure. When evening came and the bells tolled vespers across the red and gray horizon, they paused. The loaves lay cooling in rows like sleeping children, their crusts cracked, their scent heavy and honest. The baker leaned against the wall, his breath slow, his body trembling from the weight of giving. He did not dream of crowns or feasts, nor of soft beds or golden cups. His joy was simpler: a full oven, a quiet town, and no one left unfed. Outside, the streets hummed again with life, the day's first laughter breaking through the dusk. Children tore at crusts, mothers broke bread in silence, and the baker watched from his doorway. In that humble sight, smoke rising like incense into twilight, there was something divine. Not in the glory of kings or the power of swords, but in the steady hands of survival. Tomorrow, before dawn, he would rise again to feed a world that never remembered his name. But perhaps heaven did. Before the roosters crowed, before the sun dared touch the church spire, the baker was awake. He rose in darkness, a silhouette against the faint orange pulse of the oven's coals. The fire had slept lightly, as if waiting for him. It breathed when he did. He stoked it gently, whispering like a priest before an altar, feeding it slivers of wood. The air thickened again, heavy with the scent of smoke and wet flour and toil. Outside, the world was still. Only rats scurried beneath barrels. Only dogs dared bark. But within those stone walls, Life was already stirring, fierce, sweaty, sacred. He took the dough he had left to rest through the night, pressing it with both hands. The feel was familiar, coarse, elastic, stubborn, like the world he lived in. Flour clung to his fingers as if it knew it was his second skin. His wife moved beside him, quiet as shadow. She didn't need to speak. Her rhythm matched his, like twin heartbeats in the dark. Together they worked the dough into shapes that would outlast their exhaustion. Their little boy slept upstairs, curled beside sacks of grain, his dreams dusted with flour. He would grow to know this same life, hard, honest, endless. The baker's bench creaked with the weight of the morning's bread. Round loaves, flat cakes, rough rolls made for peasants, and a few fine whites for nobles. He hated those white loaves, soft as sin, made from sifted flour he could barely afford. Yet it was those pale ones that brought silver, while the dark loaves fed the poor. And so he baked them all, because no man could argue with hunger. By dawn, the street began to wake, the sound of carts, hooves, and prayer. A bell tolled for mass, another for trade, and the town took its first breath. The baker's wife lifted baskets lined with linen and carried them toward the square. Steam rose from the loaves like morning mist, warm against the chill of daybreak. The smell of bread drifted through the alleys, drawing men from doorways like moths. They came in silence, peasants, servants, soldiers, their faces pale, their stomachs empty. Each clutched a few coins, worn and brown, their worth measured in crumbs. There was no bargaining, no laughter, no cheerful chatter of markets here, just exchange, hunger for sustenance, coins for survival. The baker's wife counted quickly, her lips dry, her eyes half shut from sleepless nights. Sometimes she saw the same faces again and again, the widow, the crippled boy, the soldier. They bowed to her as if she were a saint, though she was only a woman with dough. She never corrected them. In times of hunger, even small mercies looked like miracles. Back in the shop, the baker turned the next batch. His arms ached, but his mind wandered, not to riches nor rest, but to fairness. He wondered if the king had ever smelled bread like this, bitter and real. If priests who preached of heaven had ever burned their hands in a hearth. If God himself could feel the heat that scorched his skin each dawn. The oven roared louder. The heat was alive, licking the walls, curling smoke around the rafters. He moved through it with practiced grace, his eyes stinging, his lungs raw. Every loaf pulled from the oven was a victory against time and against death. Each golden crust carried a story of struggle, of hunger turned into hope. By noon, the town was fed. Children ran with crumbs on their faces, mothers smiled, and the baker leaned on his doorframe. His shirt clung to his chest, his hair was streaked with ash and sweat. He looked at the sky, pale, clouded, indifferent, and felt the strange peace of completion. The day would come again, and the work would never end. Still, in that moment, with the smell of bread rising to heaven, he felt close to something eternal. A truth not written in scripture but baked into every crust, that even the smallest hands could hold the world together, one loaf at a time. The morning light in medieval towns never truly shone. It struggled through the soot. It slipped down crooked alleys and across rooftops bent by centuries, dim and uncertain, like a candle on the verge of dying. The air hung thick with the scent of life. Damp straw, smoke, and yesterday's rain mingling in uneasy peace. Every sound was muffled by mist, the slow creak of carts, the shuffle of wooden clogs, the distant toll of the church bell calling souls to order. And somewhere, faint but insistent, beneath that gray hum of life, drifted the smell of bread. Not the golden sweetness of modern kitchens, no soft butter, no sugar, no cheer, but something rougher, truer. It was the smell of yeast fighting to rise, of grain burned at its edges, of fire licking stone. It was the smell of work and of hunger, and it led to one place. The bakery stood hunched between two taller buildings as though time itself had leaned too hard upon it. Its doorway was blackened from years of smoke, its lintel scarred by the touch of countless hands. Inside, shadows clung to the corners, and heat rolled out in steady waves that carried the promise of sustenance and exhaustion both. This was no place of laughter or luxury. It was a forge, and what it forged was life itself. Within those walls, the world narrowed to movement and breath. Arms rose and fell, dusted white with flour. Wooden paddles struck stone floors with the rhythm of ritual. The air was thick enough to taste, a mingling of ash, yeast, and sweat that stung the throat and dulled the senses. And above it all, the great fire roared, alive, insatiable, eternal. The baker's wife moved like a ghost between the benches, sleeves rolled high, her hands slick with dough. She kneaded with practiced grace, not from love of the work, but from necessity, the kind that leaves no room for complaint. Her husband, broad-shouldered and quiet, tended the oven, his face glowing red from the reflected flame. His eyes watered from heat, but he did not blink. Bread did not wait for tears. Their only music was the steady rhythm of work, a thud, a sigh, the hiss of flame. Words dried too quickly in that heat, so they spoke with glances instead, short, familiar, enough to fill the silence. And yet, that silence was not empty. It was sacred in its own way, because every loaf pulled from that fire was more than food. It was the thin line between despair and survival. The poor would come first, hands trembling, clutching coins worn smooth by prayer and time. The baker would meet their eyes just for a moment and hand over the hard, black bread that kept them alive another day. It was not kindness, it was duty. For bread was not a gift in those days. It was the measure of a man's worth. Beyond the bakery walls, the town stirred to life. Merchants shouted their wares in the marketplace. Children ran barefoot through puddles, chasing stray dogs and laughter. But here, inside the bakery, time stood still. The air pulsed with heat and history, a rhythm as old as hunger itself. It was a world of motion and stillness, fire and patience, labor and grace. By mid-morning, the smell had thickened until it became almost visible, curling through doorways, slipping beneath shutters, winding through the narrow arteries of the town. It crept into every home, every heart. Even the rich, in their upper chambers, would pause to breathe it in. The perfume of survival, baked in stone and sweat. But few ever thought of the hands that made it. Hands blistered by flame, hands cracked by cold water and salt, hands that knew hunger too well to ever eat their fill. And still they worked, hour upon hour, loaf upon loaf, until the benches trembled beneath the weight of their labor. The fire burned on, merciless and unending, as though the sun itself had been trapped in the belly of that oven. Each loaf that emerged bore the mark of the maker, uneven, imperfect, alive. It cooled slowly on wooden boards, steam rising like the breath of prayer. The baker's wife crossed herself, not from superstition, but from habit. For in her heart she knew each day could end in ruin as easily as it began in fire. Outside, the church bells rang again. Somewhere a child cried. Somewhere a man cursed the cost of grain, and the baker lifted his paddle once more, his muscles aching, his face streaked with soot and grace. He did not look up. There was no reason to. For within that humble furnace, he held the pulse of the town in his hands. No knight could ride without him. No priest could preach without him. No king could rule without the bread that burned beneath his roof. And though no one bowed when he passed in the street, all owed him reverence. For in every crumb of bread that broke upon their tongues, they tasted his labor, the quiet, unseen power that keeps the world alive. The fire roared again, steady and unyielding. And as the baker reached for another round of dough, his shadow merged with the smoke that curled above the oven's mouth, fleeting, fragile, eternal. By the time noon bled into afternoon, the scent of bread had become the language of the town. It drifted past the stone arches of the abbey, through the market stalls, over courtyards where noble women embroidered prayers into silk. Every man, woman, and child breathed it in, though few thought to thank the fire that gave it shape. Bread was not a miracle anymore. It was an expectation. But beneath that quiet daily ritual, the whole kingdom turned upon its crust. In every loaf lay a lesson, one that even kings were slow to learn. For though a crown glittered, it could not fill an empty stomach. And though a priest could promise heaven, he too broke bread before he spoke of God. The poorest peasant and the proudest monarch shared one unspoken truth. Without the baker's hands, even faith would starve. In the monasteries, monks labored in rhythm with the hours, grinding grain to hymns. Their hands blistered, their robes powdered white with flour. They worked not for wealth, but salvation. Each loaf was an offering, placed upon the altar beside chalice and candle. The bread became Christ, they said, but still it began in soil and sweat and stone. Heaven's mystery was born from earth's hunger. Beyond the abbey walls, the market swelled with noise and bargaining. Bakers shouted prices over the clatter of hooves and the cries of hawkers selling salted fish. Women haggled fiercely, clutching baskets, counting coins twice before surrendering them. The bread they bought was coarse, gray, and heavy, but it filled their children's bellies, and that was enough. They did not ask for softness or sweetness, only survival. Yet in the royal kitchens, the fire told a different story. There, bread rose like sculpture, golden, delicate, perfumed with saffron and honey. Flour from foreign shores, ground fine as dust, sifted through silver sieves. It was bread, yes, but also proof of conquest, of empire, of power made edible. Servants carried it upon carved trays, each loaf stamped with the seal of the crown. The king would touch it lightly, as though blessing his own dominion. And somewhere far below, a peasant would chew his crust in silence, unaware that he and his ruler shared the same dependence. It was always bread that told the truth of a reign. When the harvest failed, rebellion rose with the smoke of empty ovens. When prices climbed, faith trembled. When granaries emptied, prayers turned to curses. A hungry man does not kneel for long. In famine, thrones cracked faster than ovens cooled. For bread was not just sustenance. It was the language of power itself. In the villages, priests blessed the loaves each Sabbath, tracing crosses in flour before the first cut. They said the act was sacred, but for many it was a way to measure fairness. If the loaf divided evenly, they called it grace. If not, they blamed sin or taxes or the miller's greed. Men had been hanged for stealing bread, women beaten for hoarding it, children damned for begging it. It was mercy and judgment, both baked into the same crust. Still, there was beauty in its simplicity. A loaf did not care for title or creed. It did not ask who ruled or who sinned or who prayed the loudest. It was the great equalizer, the first and final comfort of mankind. Even the dying reached for bread with trembling fingers, hoping its warmth might remind them of life. And in that, perhaps, lay the truest crown of all, not of gold, but of grain. The baker, blackened with soot, carried more power than he knew. His hands, unblessed and unthanked, shaped the rhythm of nations. Each morning, he lifted his paddle, and the kingdom stirred. Each evening, his loaves cooled in silence, while the world dreamed of peace. The fire within his oven was the same that burned in every heart, the will to endure. Empires might fall, churches crumble, kings turn to dust. But as long as someone mixed water with flour and dared to wait for it to rise, life continued. For bread was not just food, it was faith made tangible. It was the body of history itself, fragile, perishable, but infinite in meaning. And so the baker's work never truly ended. It passed from hand to hand, from century to century, from fire to fire. The taste of bread remained the same, humble, bitter, comforting. The same hunger that once filled a medieval town still hums in every soul that breaks a crust today. And if one listens closely, between the toll of the bell and the hiss of the fire, one might still hear the echo of that first loaf, the sound of survival rising softly in the heat of the hearth. The first sign was silence. No church bells rang that morning. No market cries rose through the streets. Only the hollow whisper of wind moving through empty barrels and broken shutters. The smell that once carried warmth, the heavy, living scent of bread, was gone. In its place lingered the dry ache of ash, of hunger, of waiting. The harvest had failed. Rain had drowned the fields, and what the water spared, rot devoured. Wheat turned black in the granaries, grain sprouted mold in sacks before it could be milled. The millstones stood still, their gears stiff with dust and despair. And the ovens, those sacred hearts of every town, cooled to gray, their fires dying one by one. In the bakery, the baker stood before the hearth like a priest before an empty altar. The air, once thick with life, now felt brittle, hollow, final. He lifted his hand to the cold stones and felt nothing. The fire that had roared there for decades, his companion, his burden, was gone. He did not weep. There was no strength for tears. Outside, the streets had changed. Men's faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their voices reduced to whispers. Children no longer played. They scavenged, barefoot and pale, for crumbs in the mud. Mothers carried buckets to wells that gave more echoes than water. Even the rats, once fat on the scraps of the market, had fled. At the church, the priest preached of patience and providence, his voice cracking over empty pews. He broke the last of the consecrated loaves with trembling hands, dividing it among a few faithful souls. Each crumb was received like a blessing, a taste of heaven that could not fill the stomach. He said the famine was a test, a purification by fire and faith. But the people no longer listened for God in the wind. They listened for footsteps with food. The baker's wife, once so steady, now moved like a shadow through the darkened bakery. She still kneaded dough, though there was little left to knead, a handful of barley, a scoop of ground acorn, a prayer. Her hands, once strong, shook with weakness. Each loaf she shaped seemed smaller than the last, its crust thin, its soul hollow. She placed it by the dying embers, hoping the heat might remember what it was. When the bread ran out entirely, they baked what they could not name: bark, weeds, ground peas, even dust. Still, the town gathered at the bakery door, as they always had, because habit dies slower than hope. They stood in silence, not daring to ask, only waiting for a miracle that did not come. The baker opened his hands, empty, and they understood. Some cursed him, some blessed him, most simply turned away, too tired to hate. Nights grew longer. The moonlight fell over the rooftops like cold milk, touching faces that no longer dreamed. The air grew still, as though the whole town held its breath, afraid of being forgotten. And in the silence, the baker began to pray. Not for food, not for deliverance, but for memory, that someone, somewhere, might remember the warmth of bread. Days blurred into one another. The baker's wife fell ill first, her body too thin, her breath too shallow. He stayed beside her, holding her hand near the cold oven, whispering stories of the fire that once burned there. When she passed, he did not bury her immediately. He laid her near the hearth, wrapped in the apron she had always worn, and placed a crust beside her still hand. It was all he had left to give. The next morning, he gathered what strength remained and kindled one final spark. He fed it with shavings of old wood, a handful of straw, and the brittle remains of flour sacks. The flame caught slowly, trembling, uncertain, but alive. He mixed his last handful of grain with water and salt and shaped it in silence. His hands, though trembling, moved with the memory of grace. When the loaf rose from the ashes, uneven and scorched, he smiled for the first time in weeks. He placed it on the windowsill where the scent, faint and ghostly, drifted out into the street. By nightfall, a child found it. She broke it in half and ran, barefoot, through the dark. Half she gave to her mother. The other half she hid beneath her pillow. It was gone by morning, but the warmth it carried lingered in their dreams. The baker never rose again. When they found him days later, his hands were folded over the cold stones of the oven, his face turned toward the faint light seeping through the cracks. They buried him beside his wife. Under the shadow of the bakery, he had kept alive longer than most believed possible. And when spring returned, when green began to whisper through the dead fields again, a wildflower grew between the cracks of the bakery floor. Its petals pale as flour, its scent faintly sweet. The people said it smelled like bread. Centuries later, the town was quieter, cobblestones no longer echoing the rumble of carts or hawkers' cries. The bakery still stood, or rather, what remained of it, a hollow shell of stone and soot. Half swallowed by creeping ivy, its doorway bowed with age, leaning toward the ground as if remembering. Inside, where the fire once lived, moss grew thick in cracks, green and soft as time passed. Through a broken window, pale light poured in like grace, touching the dust in silver threads. The air was still but not dead, carrying something faint, like a whisper left behind long ago. A memory lingered. If you stood there long enough, you could almost hear the rhythm again. The thud of dough, the scrape of the wooden peel, the low sigh of the oven flame. Not loud, but living somewhere between silence and song. A heartbeat that belonged to forgotten hands. A young scholar from the city came one spring morning drawn by tales of the baker's ruin. He carried scrolls, ink, and countless questions, but he discovered something closer to prayer instead. He brushed away moss from the old oven mouth and studied the blackened stone carefully. There were still dark scars left by hands that had fed the hunger of 1,000 souls. In that darkness, he imagined faces. A woman's arms dusted with flour, moving with practiced devotion. A man's shoulders bowed beneath the weight of dawn, yet his hands worked with steady, measured strength. He imagined the heat, the endless fire giving warmth and meaning to a village nearly unknown. Each loaf held life, each ember breathed history, shaping survival from grain, fire, and enduring hope. He took a piece of the fallen brick, held it close, and smelled, not quite air, but memory. Something ghostly sweet, like the echo of bread long gone cold, still lingering in the corners. That night, he wrote in his journal, pondering what ruins teach about humanity's enduring faith. How strange that in ruins we find the purest faith. They baked not for glory, but love. As he wrote, a breeze moved gently through the hollow doorway, carrying scents of spring wheat. From fields beyond the hill, young shoots rose where soil had once been broken by calloused hands. The same soil that had grown barley, rye, and humble grains that built empires without crowns. Bread was never just bread. It was covenant, communion, and quiet miracle that made the world endure. The scholar lingered until evening, when the light began to fade and shadows stretched long. He lit a single candle and placed it where the oven had once roared, now empty. Its glow flickered against old stones, and for a moment, the room seemed to breathe life again. He saw them, bakers of old, arms moving in rhythm, faces softened by sweat and devotion. He imagined children waiting outside with coins, priests blessing loaves before Mass, kings breaking bread beside beggars, all bound by one small act of hunger met with love, uniting the village across time and space. The candle burned lower. and he thought how easily civilizations forget the hands that fed them faithfully. Warriors are remembered, monarchs gilded in stories, but bakers vanish like smoke, yet leave sustenance behind. When the flame went out, the scholar gathered his scrolls and stepped into the cool night air. Moonlight fell over ruins, soft and silver, scattered across stones like flour upon the world itself. In that silence, he felt what every soul had once felt when the first loaf rose from fire. A kind of peace without name, only warmth, carried invisibly through the centuries to the living. Years later, pilgrims visited that same ruin not to worship, but to remember what had been done. Children ran hands across stones. Mothers whispered that once this place had given life to everyone. The old closed their eyes, breathing deeply, as if catching the faint ghost of bread in their hearts. And perhaps they did. Memory, like yeast, never dies, only sleeps until warmth wakes it again. So the bakery remained, a skeleton of devotion, a monument not of marble but of hunger and hope. Each stone held echoes of human hands. Each breath of wind carried the song of the oven fire. If you listen closely, when evening falls and fields turn gold, you might still hear it softly. A faint crackle, a soft sigh, the scent of bread returning again. Not food, but faith, love. Not labor, not past, but the memory of what it truly means to be human, alive, connected. As long as warmth exists in the world, the story of bread and those who shaped it will rise. Long after the scholar's candle burned out, the town grew, fell, and rose again across centuries. Empires shifted, roads changed, and languages evolved, yet the ruin remained quietly beneath ivy and rain. It stood as if guarding a secret, something that no living soul could ever fully name. Sometimes, when storms rolled in from distant hills, villagers swore they saw a faint orange glow. It shimmered where the old bakery once stood, a trick of lightning or the oven's memory. Or perhaps it was the ghost of fire remembering itself, flickering stubbornly against centuries of dust. In time, a new bakery opened along the river, its shelves lined with golden sugared buns. Windows gleamed with light, warm and inviting, and children pressed faces eagerly to the shining glass. The smell of yeast drifted through streets again, sweeter, cleaner, lighter than any could remember before. But to those who knew, it remained the same song, the same rising, the same patient waiting, the same gift, handed from hands long gone to those who now broke bread with reverence. Even simple loaves carried history, memory, and a kind of quiet, enduring, invisible blessing still. An old woman visited at dawn each week, her shawl drawn tight around her fragile shoulders. Her steps were slow and careful, yet steady, and she would purchase a single plain loaf. With trembling hands, she tore it in half, whispering softly to the air above the counter. "For those who came before us," she murmured, acknowledging the lineage of hands and heat unseen. Sometimes the baker's boy would ask why she never spoke to anyone else at all. She smiled softly, eyes distant, as if conversing with a world invisible to the living eye. "I'm not speaking to no one," she said gently. "I am speaking to the fire itself tonight." And as she walked away down the foggy street, the boy noticed something impossible, shimmering subtly. The air around her seemed touched by heat not of this world, alive with quiet memory. Years later, when he grew to take over the bakery, the boy kept her secret alive. Each morning, he lit a small candle before the oven, honoring hands that had worked centuries past. Not because he believed in ghosts, but because it felt right, sacred, and wholly necessary. It reminded him that even the simplest act, a loaf, a meal, a quiet kindness, is part of something far older than ourselves, a tradition that feeds both body and soul. Generations passed. The town changed names, borders, rulers, but the ritual endured without faltering. A candle, a loaf, a single moment of quiet reflection before the dawn began again. And if you wander through the soft fog of morning, you might still smell that same faint fragrance. Not quite bread, not quite ash, but something in between, lingering, persistent, and almost holy. The scent of memory, the echo of hands that fed a world through fire, flour, and love. The warmth of human care disguised as labor, humble work that shaped communities over lifetimes. For in the end, that is all that ever truly remains, beyond crowns, swords, and carved prayers. Only the bread and the hearts that rose beside it, bearing the quiet miracle of human connection.